March 25, 1911. A quiet Saturday afternoon in New York City's garment district. On the 8th floor of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, smoke curled up from a scrap bin. Within minutes, flames tore through the room, feeding on piles of cloth and paper. Workers ran for the stairs, only to find the doors locked. Some pounded desperately at the metal, screaming for help. Others ran to the windows, clinging to the sills, staring down at the street below. And in that moment, they faced an impossible choice: burn or jump. In the early years of the 20th century, New York City pulsed with the hum of progress. The garment industry was booming, and at its heart stood the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, a place that seemed to promise opportunity to hundreds of recent immigrants. Inside, the air was thick, not with promise, but with cotton dust that clung to every surface and floated like tiny snowflakes in the dim light. Rows upon rows of sewing machines rattled endlessly, operated by young women, many barely out of their teens. Most had arrived from Italy or Eastern Europe, chasing the dream of a better life, only to find themselves hunched over fabric for 12 to 14 hours a day. The shirtwaists they made were the height of fashion, light blouses worn by the modern working woman, but the wages earned for each piece were painfully small. Every moment was accounted for. Supervisors patrolled the aisles, watching for any pause in work. On the wooden floors, scraps of fabric piled up ankle-deep. Paper patterns hung from racks. Everywhere you looked, the building was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. But perhaps most dangerous of all were the locked doors, a practice the owners insisted upon to prevent theft and keep the women from taking breaks. In 1911, such rules were not only common, they were accepted. Safety was a luxury few employers considered worth the cost. It was late on a Saturday, March 25, 1911. The workday was nearly done. Machines slowed as the women reached for the last piles of fabric. Conversations softened into tired murmurs. And then, the spark. Somewhere in the cramped cutting room on the 8th floor, a small flicker appeared in the corner of a scrap bin. Maybe from a match, maybe from a careless cigarette, no one could say for sure. At first, it was just a thin wisp of smoke curling upward, almost delicate. But in a room stacked high with paper patterns, wooden tables, and piles of cotton, that wisp became a roaring flame in seconds. The fire moved like it had been waiting for this moment. Cotton dust in the air flashed a light. Long strips of cloth hanging from hooks became instant torches. Heat rolled through the room in waves, pressing against the workers' skin. On the 8th floor, someone shouted into the telephone to warn the office on the 10th. Their voices shook, the words almost tripping over each other. But no one thought to call the 9th floor, the floor where most of the workers were. Down there, the women kept sewing, unaware that death was racing toward them. By the time they smelled the smoke, the fire was already there, crawling across the ceiling, blocking the stairwell, and turning their factory into a trap. By the time the fire burst into the 9th floor, the room dissolved into chaos. Workers screamed over the roar of the flames, shoving past one another in a desperate rush for the exits. But the main stairwell, their only familiar escape, was locked. It always was. The owners claimed it stopped theft and unauthorized breaks, but now it was a death sentence. Workers pounded on the door, their fists turning raw, but it didn't budge. Some turned toward the fire escape, a thin, rusting structure clinging to the side of the building like a skeleton. Dozens crowded onto it at once, their weight making the metal groan. The heat from the fire warped its joints. The bolts began to pull free from the brick. And then, with a scream of tearing steel, it twisted, snapped, and collapsed into the alley below. Those who made it to the elevators found another fleeting hope. The operators, real heroes that day, made trip after trip, carrying as many as they could. But the heat was relentless. Cables began to warp, the machinery hissed and groaned, and soon the elevators froze between floors. For the hundreds still trapped inside, there were no more ways out. The air was black with smoke. The fire was everywhere. And every second, The walls of their world closed in. On the street below, people had gathered, neighbors, passers-by, shoppers, all staring upward in horror. Thick, black smoke poured from the upper floors of the ash building, curling into the afternoon sky. From the sidewalks, they shouted with all the urgency in their lungs, "Don't jump! Hold on!" But inside, the reality was merciless. The heat was unbearable. The air was poisonous. Flames pressed closer with every second. For those trapped, the windows were no longer boundaries. They were the only escape from an even more certain death. Some workers stood frozen, trembling on the ledges, the wind whipping at their hair and skirts. Others didn't hesitate. They stepped forward, clasping hands with friends, with sisters, with strangers, and leapt into the open air together. Below, the crowd gasped in unison as bodies fell. Some hit the tangled remains of the collapsed fire escape. Others struck the pavement with a sound that, as survivor Rose Friedman would later say, "I can never forget the thud as they hit the ground." The street became a grim tableau. Rows of lifeless bodies covered hastily with coats and fabric, the cries of the living mixing with the silence of the dead. In that moment, the fire had taken more than lives. It had shattered an entire city's sense of safety. In just 18 minutes, it was over. 146 lives gone. The youngest was only 14 years old, a girl who had come to America with dreams of sending money home to her family. The oldest was just 43. Most were young immigrant women from Italy and Eastern Europe, their lives defined by long hours, low pay, and endless sacrifice. Some lay in the ruins of the collapsed fire escape. Others were unrecognizable, their bodies claimed by the flames. Many were found on the sidewalks, hands still entwined with friends or relatives, as if holding on even in their final moments. When the last embers cooled, the city's streets fell silent. Crowds that had once shouted in desperation now stood motionless, faces pale, eyes hollow. The air smelled of smoke and ash. New York, a city used to noise, to movement, to the constant churn of life, found itself stunned into stillness. This wasn't just a workplace accident. It was a catastrophe, the scale of which the city had never seen. And it left an unshakable question hanging in the air. How could this have been allowed to happen? Grief turned quickly to fury. In the days after the fire, New York streets became rivers of black. Tens of thousands joined the funeral procession, their footsteps echoing through Manhattan. Women in mourning veils, men in flat caps, children clutching photographs of mothers or sisters who would never come home. It was more than a funeral. It was a demand for justice. The public wanted answers, and someone to blame. The names Max Blank and Isaac Harris, owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, were printed in every newspaper. They stood trial for manslaughter, accused of locking the doors that had trapped so many workers. But the courtroom became a spectacle. The defense argued there was no proof the owners knew the doors were locked. Witnesses were challenged, their credibility questioned. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned with its verdict, not guilty. The city erupted again, this time in outrage. Months later, it was revealed that Blank and Harris collected more money from their insurance than the victims' families ever saw. For each life lost, the families received just $75. To the owners, the fire was not a tragedy. It was a profitable inconvenience. The Triangle Fire was more than a tragedy. It became a turning point in American history. In its wake, grief fueled determination. Public outrage was channeled into action. In New York State alone, over 30 new labor laws were passed within just a few years, addressing everything from mandatory fire drills to unlocked exits and proper fire escapes. What had been ignored for decades, dangerous factories, unregulated working conditions, the silent suffering of immigrant labor, could no longer be overlooked. Across the country, fire safety standards were rewritten. Inspections became law, and the idea that human lives were worth less than profit was challenged like never before. The labor movement surged forward, powered by the voices of those who had seen the flames firsthand. Women, many of them survivors or friends of the victims, stepped into leadership roles. They stood before crowds and legislators, declaring that no worker should ever again face the choice between burning alive or leaping to their death. The Triangle Fire had ended 146 lives in just 18 minutes, but its legacy would save countless others for generations to come. Today, more than a century later, the building still stands. Once the site of unimaginable terror, the Ash Building is now part of New York University, its walls silent witnesses to history. On its corner, a bronze plaque is fixed into the stone. The words are simple: the date, March 25, 1911, and the number of lives lost, 146. There are no elaborate inscriptions, no poetic flourishes, just the stark truth, left to speak for itself. Every year, on that date, people gather in the shadow of the building. Descendants of the victims, labor activists, students, and strangers come together. They stand shoulder to shoulder as the names are read aloud, each one followed by the haunting toll of a bell. The crowd listens in complete silence, the sounds of modern Manhattan fading into the background. For a moment, the city pauses, and time bends, bringing the past into the present. The reading ends, but the promise remains: they will never be forgotten.